Carl Jung wrote something in his final years that shocked even his most devoted followers and caused religious authorities to denounce him as a heretic. He claimed that Jesus Christ wasn't the son of a perfect, all-knowing God descending to save humanity. Instead, Jesus represented something far more psychologically radical and theologically disturbing. Jung argued that Jesus was the moment when God became conscious of his own shadow, when the divine itself underwent a psychological transformation, when the unconscious ground of reality had to confront what it had been denying about its own nature. In Jung's most controversial work, Answer to Job, he presented an idea that seemed blasphemous to traditional theology but was psychologically inevitable: that God, understood as a symbol of the collective unconscious, was not complete, not fully conscious, not integrated. The God of the Old Testament was powerful but contradictory, creative but destructive, loving but wrathful, a deity who seemed unaware of his own shadow, who acted without full consciousness of the implications of his actions. And Jesus, in Jung's interpretation, represented consciousness entering into this unconscious divine, the moment when God had to face his own darkness, integrate his own rejected aspects, and transform through the same process of individuation that Jung mapped in human psychology. This wasn't just a reinterpretation of Christian theology. It was Jung's attempt to explain why evil exists, why suffering is built into the structure of reality, and why the Incarnation had to happen not for humanity's sake, but for God's own psychological development. To understand Jung's radical thesis, you have to see what he saw when he analyzed the character of God in the Old Testament, with the same psychological lens he applied to human patience. Jung recognized that Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Moses, and Job, behaves in ways that reveal a profound lack of self-awareness, a deity who acts with tremendous power but without full consciousness of his own nature or the consequences of his actions. Look at the creation narrative itself. God creates the world and calls it good, creates human beings in his own image, places them in paradise with one arbitrary restriction about a tree of knowledge. Then a serpent, which God himself must have created, tempts the humans to eat from the forbidden tree. They do, and God responds with rage, cursing them and all their descendants with suffering, labor, pain in childbirth, and eventual death. Jung asks the obvious psychological question: if God is omniscient, didn't he know this would happen? If he's omnipotent, why create the serpent and the temptation in the first place? If he's perfectly good, why respond to such a minor transgression with such catastrophic punishment affecting billions of innocent future generations? The behavior reveals what Jung called a split in God's own nature, an unconscious shadow that God himself doesn't recognize or acknowledge. This pattern repeats throughout the Old Testament with increasing intensity. God makes a covenant with Noah, promising never again to destroy the world, then repeatedly threatens exactly that destruction. God chooses the Israelites as his special people, promises to protect them, then subjects them to slavery, exile, invasion, destruction when they fail to meet his demands. God claims to be just and merciful, but drowns entire populations, orders genocides of enemy tribes, including children, sends plagues and famines that kill the innocent along with the guilty. And most tellingly, in the book of Job, God allows Satan to torture a righteous man just to win a bet, to prove a point, to demonstrate his own power. Job loses his children, his health, his possessions, everything, not because he's done anything wrong, but because God wants to test his faith. And when Job finally demands an explanation, God responds not with reasons but with power, essentially saying, "I'm God, I can do what I want, who are you to question me?" Jung saw in this response the rage of the unconscious when confronted with consciousness, the fury of power when asked to justify itself, the defensiveness of a deity who cannot or will not examine his own shadow. The God of the Old Testament, Jung argued, is a perfect symbol of the unconscious itself in its raw, undifferentiated state. Tremendously powerful, capable of both creation and destruction, but not fully conscious, not self-reflective, not integrated. This God contains opposites without resolving them. He's simultaneously loving and wrathful, creative and destructive, just and arbitrary. He acts according to mood and impulse rather than consistent principles. He demands moral behavior from humans while exempting himself from those same standards. He projects his own shadow onto humanity, blaming humans for the evil that he himself introduced into creation. And most importantly, he lacks what Jung called consciousness, the ability to see oneself clearly, to recognize one's own contradictions, to take responsibility for one's own shadow rather than projecting it onto others. Jung recognized that this wasn't a literal description of a cosmic being, but a precise psychological symbol of the collective unconscious, the vast ground of psyche that exists prior to consciousness, that contains all opposites, all potentials, all archetypes in their raw, undifferentiated form. The collective unconscious is powerful beyond measure. It's the source of all consciousness, all creativity, all life. But it's not aware of itself. It doesn't know what it is or what it's doing. It acts through compulsion, through archetypal patterns, through forces that operate below the level of conscious awareness. This is where Jesus enters Jung's narrative, and why the Incarnation takes on such radically different meaning than traditional theology suggests. Jesus isn't God descending to save humanity from sin. Jesus is consciousness emerging from the unconscious divine, God beginning the process of becoming aware of himself, the collective unconscious starting to individuate through human consciousness. The Incarnation means God entering into matter, into limitation, into human existence with all its constraints and suffering. And Jung saw this as psychologically necessary because consciousness can only emerge through limitation, through being forced to confront what it is by experiencing what it's not, through facing the shadow by living within the conditions that the shadow has created. God as pure spirit, as unlimited power, as unconscious force, could never become conscious because consciousness requires boundaries, requires confrontation with limitation, requires the experience of suffering and constraint that forces self-reflection. By becoming human, by taking on flesh, by experiencing hunger, pain, temptation, betrayal, mortality, God enters into the very conditions that human consciousness faces. And more importantly, God enters into the conditions that his own unconscious shadow has created through the curse after Eden, through all the suffering built into material existence. Jung saw the life of Jesus as God's confrontation with his own shadow, the divine undergoing the same process of individuation that humans must undergo. Every temptation Jesus faces, every challenge, every moment of doubt is God encountering aspects of himself that were unconscious, bringing them into awareness, choosing how to respond consciously rather than automatically. The temptation in the desert is God facing the seduction of power without consciousness. The cleansing of the temple is God facing his own rage and judgment. The agony in Gethsemane is God experiencing the full weight of suffering that his creation has endured, feeling the abandonment and fear that countless humans have felt while praying to a God who seems absent. And the crucifixion itself, the moment when Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" This is the most psychologically significant moment in Jung's interpretation because it represents God experiencing his own absence, the divine feeling what it's like to be human and abandoned by the divine, consciousness confronting the unconscious ground from which it emerged and finding it dark, silent, apparently indifferent. This is not comfortable theology. It suggests that God himself is incomplete, that the divine is undergoing development, that consciousness is not a gift from above, but an emergence from below that transforms the very ground from which it emerges. But Jung argued this is the only interpretation that makes psychological sense of evil, suffering, and the Incarnation itself. If God is already perfect, complete, fully conscious, then evil is inexplicable. Why would a perfect God create a world filled with suffering? Why would an all-knowing deity set up conditions that he knows will lead to catastrophe? Why would a loving father curse his children for a minor transgression? Traditional theodicy tries to answer these questions by giving humans free will and blaming them for choosing evil. But Jung saw this as inadequate because it doesn't explain why God created the conditions for evil in the first place, why the serpent was in the garden, why suffering is built into the structure of material existence itself. Jung's answer was uncomfortable but psychologically consistent. Evil exists because God himself has an unconscious shadow, because the divine creative force contains both light and darkness in undifferentiated form, because consciousness hasn't yet fully emerged from the unconscious ground of being. The shadow of God is projected into creation itself, manifesting as the structural violence, suffering, and evil that permeate material existence. And humans, created in God's image, inherit this same split, this same unconscious shadow, this same capacity for both tremendous creativity and terrible destruction. The recognition that humans are made in the image of an unconscious, contradictory God, rather than a perfect one, actually explains human nature better than traditional theology ever could. We're not corrupted versions of an originally perfect nature. We're expressions of a creative force that contains both light and shadow, consciousness and unconsciousness, order and chaos. Our task isn't to return to an original purity that never existed. It's to do the work that God himself is doing through the Incarnation, to bring consciousness to the unconscious, to integrate the shadow rather than project it, to become whole rather than remaining split. This is why Jesus' teachings focus so intensely on shadow work, without ever using that language. Love your enemies means stop projecting your shadow onto them and recognize they're reflecting something you refuse to see in yourself. Take the log out of your own eye before pointing to the speck in your neighbor's eye means address your own unconscious material before judging others. Let he who is without sin cast the first stone means recognize your own shadow before participating in collective scapegoating. The entire Sermon on the Mount can be read as instructions for making the unconscious conscious, for recognizing that what you judge in others exists in you, that what you hate externally is what you've repressed internally, that the kingdom of heaven within is the integrated self that emerges when consciousness and unconscious, light and shadow, are brought together rather than held in opposition. Jesus, as God becoming conscious, teaches humans the method for consciousness to emerge from unconsciousness, because he's undergoing that same process at the divine level. Every parable about losing and finding, dying and being reborn, the last being first and the first last, these are descriptions of the psychological transformation that happens when the ego dies to its limited identification and the self emerges from the unconscious. But the most radical implication of Jung's theory is what it says about the crucifixion. In traditional theology, the crucifixion is God punishing his Son to satisfy divine justice, Jesus taking on the punishment that humans deserved for their sins. Jung saw this as God punishing himself for his own shadow, the divine taking responsibility for the suffering that unconscious creative force had introduced into existence. The crucifixion is God experiencing the full weight of what his unconscious shadow has created, feeling the abandonment, torture, and death that billions of conscious beings have experienced in a world structured by unconscious divine forces. It's the moment when God stops projecting his shadow onto humanity and recognizes that the darkness humans manifest is ultimately sourced in the unconscious darkness of the divine itself. The cry of dereliction, "Why have you forsaken me?" is God recognizing his own absence, consciousness confronting the unconscious void, the divine becoming aware of what it's like to exist in a world where God seems absent, because God himself was unconscious. And then comes the resurrection, which Jung interpreted not as a physical body coming back to life, but as the emergence of the integrated self after the death of the unconscious God. The resurrected Christ is no longer the unconscious Yahweh who acted from power without consciousness. He's the transformed divine, God who has integrated his shadow through experiencing its effects, the self that emerges when opposites are held together rather than split apart. The resurrected Christ bears the wounds of crucifixion permanently. In Jung's reading, this is crucial because it means the shadow doesn't disappear through integration. The scars remain, the memory of suffering remains, but it's no longer unconscious and projected. It's been brought into awareness, accepted, integrated into a larger wholeness. God after the resurrection is not the same as God before the Incarnation. Something irreversible has happened. Consciousness has emerged from the unconscious ground of being, and that changes everything about how the divine relates to creation. This is why Jung argued that Christianity needed a fourth element, a divine quaternity rather than trinity. The Trinity of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit represents the movement toward consciousness but leaves out the shadow, the dark aspect that must be integrated for wholeness. Jung provocatively suggested that the missing fourth element is the devil, or more precisely, what the devil symbolizes, the shadow of God himself. Until the dark aspect is consciously acknowledged and integrated rather than projected onto Satan as a separate being, the divine remains incomplete, the God image remains split, and humans continue to project their darkness onto scapegoats rather than integrating it. The Incarnation began this process of integration, but Jung believed it was incomplete, that human consciousness had to continue the work that God started through Jesus, that every person who does the work of individuation is participating in the ongoing transformation of the divine itself. This might be the most heretical idea Jung ever proposed, and it's why religious authorities condemned him, why even many of his psychological colleagues found it too speculative, too theological, too disturbing. The idea that God himself needs to evolve, that the divine undergoes transformation, that consciousness emerges from unconsciousness at every level, including the ultimate level of the ground of being itself. This threatens every notion of a perfect, unchanging, all-knowing deity. But Jung argued that his interpretation actually makes sense of what traditional theology cannot explain. It explains evil without blaming humans entirely and without making God seem sadistic or incompetent. It explains suffering as the inevitable result of unconscious creative force and the necessary condition for consciousness to emerge. It explains the Incarnation as serving God's development as much as humanity's salvation. And it places tremendous responsibility and purpose in human consciousness, suggesting that when you do the work of integrating your shadow, when you make your unconscious conscious, when you individuate, you're not just transforming yourself, but participating in the transformation of the divine ground itself. Jesus, in this reading, is the symbol and the process of consciousness emerging from unconsciousness, God becoming aware of God, the self integrating the shadow, wholeness emerging from split. And every human being faces the same task, the same conflict between consciousness and unconsciousness, the same need to bring light to darkness not by destroying it, but by integrating it, the same call to continue the work that the Incarnation began. If this exploration of Jung's most controversial theory has disturbed something in you, awakened questions about the nature of consciousness and the divine, challenged your assumptions about God and evil and the purpose of human existence, then subscribe to this channel, because we're continuing to explore these profound psychological and spiritual territories where depth psychology meets mysticism, where ancient wisdom gets translated into modern understanding, where the comfortable certainties get questioned in service of deeper truth. The conflict between God and the unconscious isn't ancient mythology. It's the ongoing struggle of consciousness to emerge from darkness, of awareness to integrate shadow, of wholeness to emerge from split. And you're not just witnessing that struggle, you're participating in it every time you choose consciousness over unconsciousness, integration over projection, wholeness over division.